Why your M365 business continuity plan fails without isolated backup vault architecture. Relying on native Microsoft 365 versioning creates a dangerous illusion of safety because synchronized corruption propagates instantly across every redundant node. We must architect air-gapped, immutable backup vaults that exist entirely outside the production tenant's identity perimeter. Without this physical and logical isolation, ransomware will systematically incinerate our entire digital estate. Hooks show more, the fear-based contrarian. Most IT leaders are sleeping on a ticking time bomb because they trust Microsoft 365's native versioning to save them. In reality, that synchronization is a death trap. When ransomware hits, the corruption propagates instantly to every node. If your backup isn't behind an air-gapped vault, your entire estate is already gone. The expert architect's warning outline: show more the illusion of native redundancy, clarify the dangerous misunderstanding between high availability and true data backup. Explain how instant synchronization causes ransomware and file corruption to propagate across all nodes in real time. Highlight the 2026 threat landscape where automated malware exploits native versioning to overwrite history. The single identity trap. Thumbnails show more titles. Show more M365 backup isn't enough. The case for isolated vault architecture. Why your M365 business continuity plan will fail when you need it most. The air gap essential. Securing Microsoft 365 against ransomware persistence, beyond geo-redundancy. Why M365 disaster recovery requires isolated vaults. The mechanics of instant corruption. The sync trap is a design choice that has become your greatest vulnerability. In a cloud-native world, we prioritize real-time replication. We want every change to be everywhere, instantly. But in a crisis, that speed is the enemy of recovery. We have to distinguish between mechanical failure and logical failure. Redundancy solves for hardware. If a server in a Dublin data center melts, you don't notice. The system fails over. That is mechanical resilience. But redundancy ignores malicious intent. It cannot distinguish between a legitimate user editing a document and a ransomware script systematically destroying a file library. Look at the 501 version attack. This isn't theoretical anymore. Research has confirmed that automated ransomware as a service scripts can bypass the 500 version safety net in mere minutes. Most admins think version history is a vault. They think it's a separate copy of the data. It isn't. Versioning is just a file attribute. It is a piece of metadata stored alongside the file. And because it is an attribute, it can be manipulated. An attacker with the right permissions doesn't even need to encrypt your files. They just need to edit them. If a script performs 501 sequential edits, it fills the 500 version limit with junk. The original clean version is pushed out of the stack and deleted forever. This is the 10-minute wipeout. By using the Microsoft Graph API, an automated attack can purge version histories across 10,000 files in less time than it takes to finish a cup of coffee. The speed is staggering. You aren't fighting a human. You are fighting an API-driven automation that moves at the speed of the cloud. While your SOC team is still triaging the first alert, the script has already incinerated the recovery points for your most critical SharePoint sites. It moves through your OneDrive folders like a wildfire. And don't look to the recycle bin for salvation. It provides a false sense of security. In a tenant-wide compromise, the first thing an attacker does is target the privileged roles. Once they have global admin or even a specific site collection admin role, they can empty the recycle bin with a single command. Or worse, they use hard delete workflows that bypass the bin entirely. Microsoft recently introduced priority cleanup workflows that allow for the permanent removal of data to manage storage bloat. In the hands of a malicious actor, these are weapons. They aren't bugs, they are features of the platform being used against you. You are operating under the assumption that the platform is a neutral observer. It isn't. The platform is a high-speed engine designed for throughput. If you feed it a disaster, it will deliver that disaster to every endpoint and every replica in your organization before you can even reach for the off switch. The sync engine doesn't care if the data it's moving is a quarterly report or a ransom note. It just moves bits. It does its job perfectly. And that is the problem. This is why the current model is broken. We've built a system where the backup is physically and logically tethered to the production environment. They share the same infrastructure, they share the same APIs, and most importantly, they share the same identity perimeter. The speed of the attack is a massive problem, but it's manageable if you have the keys to a separate room. If you can stop the bleeding, you can recover. But the real issue, the one that actually kills the business, is where we've placed those keys. We've put them in the same pocket as the production data. The single identity trap. The single identity trap is the structural flaw that turns a local incident into a total business wipeout. We talk about the cloud as this distributed resilient thing, but for most of you, your entire organization hangs by a single thread called Microsoft Entra ID. This is the shared identity perimeter. It is the one trust boundary that governs everything. Your email, your files, your ERP system, and crucially, your backups. If you are using a backup solution that authenticates against your production tenant, you don't have a backup, you have a mirror. Think about the mechanics of that relationship. You've built a vault, but you're using the same keycard that opens the front door. In a traditional on-premises world, we had physical separation. You had a tape, you put it in a truck, you drove that truck to a different building. That is a hard air gap. But in the cloud, we've traded physical distance for logical convenience. We've consolidated our identity. Now analyze the blast radius. If a single global admin account is compromised, or if a high-privilege OAuth token is stolen, that identity has the authority to reach out and touch every asset you own. It doesn't matter if you've labeled your backup as immutable. If the identity used to manage that immutability is the same identity that was just hijacked, the attacker simply logs in and turns the protection off. We're seeing this play out with the consent fix reality. Attackers aren't just looking for your password anymore. They want your consent. They use legitimate app registrations to trick users into granting broad permissions. Once that app is authorized, it has a persistent token. It stays in. It lives outside of your MFA requirements. It doesn't care if you change your password. It has a direct line into your data via the Graph API. And because we often grant these apps read and write access to simplify our workflows, we are effectively handing an automated script the permission to modify our backups in real time. This is why 40% of immutable backup failures aren't technical. They aren't caused by a bug in the code or a disk failure. They are identity misconfigurations. It happens because we assume the vault is a separate place. But in a single tenant architecture, there is no separate place. There is only one trust boundary. If you are air-gapping your data into a different folder within the same Entra tenant, you are just moving your money from your left pocket to your right pocket while the thief is holding both of your arms. The fallacy of the internal vault is the most dangerous myth in modern IT. Logical separation is impossible within a single trust boundary. If the same root identity can see the production data and the recovery data, the isolation is a lie. True resilience requires a break in that chain. It requires an architecture where the identity that manages the backup has no relationship, none, to the identity that manages the production environment. Without that separation, you aren't building a safety net. You are just building a more expensive version of the disaster. This identity overlap creates a legal and regulatory vacuum that most firms aren't prepared for. You've essentially built a house where every door is opened by the same master key. When that key is stolen, the vault is just another room for the thief to explore. This is where the model breaks. You navigate, you search, you assume you are safe. But the assumption is flawed. Work doesn't start with navigation, it starts with context. And context matters. The regulatory and legal liability gap. This identity overlap doesn't just create a technical vulnerability. It opens a massive legal chasm. If you are operating in the financial sector, you are likely familiar with SEC Rule 17A4. It is the gold standard for record keeping. It mandates that your data must be stored in a non-rewritable, non-erasable format. But here is the part most IT architects miss. The SEC doesn't just care about the bits being locked, they care about who holds the crowbar. Rule 17A4F requires a designated third party or D3P. This is an independent entity that has the technical ability to provide your records to the regulator if your firm is unable or unwilling to do so. Microsoft is very clear about this. They provide the infrastructure, they provide the purview tools, but they are not your D3P. They will not sign that attestation letter for you. They won't provide the direct SEC access required by law. When a regulator knocks, and you point at your native M365 retention policy, you aren't showing them a compliance solution. You are showing them a confession. You are admitting that you've centralized your risk in a way that violates the spirit and the letter of the law. Without an independent, isolated vault, you are essentially telling the SEC that your data is only as safe as your global admin's password. That is a non-starter in a 2026 audit. We have to look at the shared responsibility model through a courtroom lens. Microsoft is responsible for the SaaS. They guarantee the service is available, they guarantee the buttons work. But you are responsible for the data. If an attacker uses a legitimate API to wipe your tenant, Microsoft hasn't failed. Their system performed exactly as programmed. It processed a valid, authenticated request to delete data. In court, the sync engine did it is not a defense. It is an admission of negligence. You chose the architecture. You chose to keep the recovery keys in the same trust boundary as the production threat. The legal landscape is shifting rapidly under our feet. Look at the implementation of NIS2 and DORA in Europe. We are moving away from corporate fines and toward personal liability. Under these frameworks, CISOs and board members can be held personally accountable for recovery negligence. If a major outage occurs and the investigation reveals that your backups were stored in the same Entra tenant as your production data, allowing the ransomware to jump across and kill both, that isn't just a bad day at the office. It's a breach of fiduciary duty. You failed to implement state-of-the-art resilience, and in 2026, state-of-the-art means isolation. Then there is the silent killer, configuration drift. Native tools often fail 17A4 audits because they lack a tamper-proof audit trail that exists outside the production loop. If an admin changes a retention policy today, that change is logged within the same system. If an attacker compromises that system, they can delete the logs of their own changes. You lose the chain of custody. You lose the ability to prove to a regulator that the data they are seeing is authentic and unaltered. A native tool is a self-policing system. And regulators hate self-policing systems. Finally, we have to stop pretending that high availability satisfies the legal definition of immutable storage. They are opposites. High availability is about fluid, constant change. Immutability is about frozen, unchangeable truth. Trying to use one to achieve the other is a category error. If the native tools can't meet the legal bar, and they can't meet the technical bar, we have to look at the economics of the alternative. Because for many of you, the cost of doing it wrong is actually higher than the cost of doing it right. The TCO of native versus isolated architecture. Most architects assume native is cheaper because it's built in. They see the pay-as-you-go model and think it scales with their needs, but the reality is the storage bloat tax. Microsoft charges you 15 cents per gigabyte per month. That sounds small until you realize what you're paying for. You aren't just paying for your active files, you are paying for every version, every deleted item, and every piece of garbage sitting in your preservation hold libraries. It is an economic dead end. You are essentially paying a premium to store your own digital waste. As your data grows, this bill becomes a runaway train that your budget cannot stop. Compare that to the architecture of an isolated vault. If you move that data to a specialized object storage provider like Wasabi, the price drops to less than 1 cent, specifically 0.0068. That is a 22 times difference in raw storage costs. Think about that gap. You are overpaying by 2,000% for a storage bucket that is less secure because it's tethered to your production identity. It makes no sense. You are paying for the convenience of stay in the box, but the box is made of gold and has a glass door. Let's look at the numbers for a 10,000 user organization. At scale, you are likely looking at 2 petabytes of protected data once you factor in the replicas and the versioning. Under the native Microsoft 365 backup model, that 2 petabyte footprint carries a price tag of $300,000 per year in Azure charges alone. That is $300,000 for a solution that lacks full Microsoft Teams support, offers limited granular recovery, and keeps your safety net inside the same burning building as your production data. Now, compare that to an isolated vault architecture using third-party software and low-cost object storage. Even when you factor in the licensing cost for a premium tool like Veeam or Druva, the storage component, using a provider like Wasabi at 0.0068 per gigabyte drops from $25,000 a month to roughly $13,000. Over a 5-year horizon, the total cost of ownership differential for a mid-sized enterprise can exceed $1 million. You are paying a massive simplicity tax for native tools that actually increase your risk profile. The native model is consumption-based, meaning it rewards inefficiency. The more bloat you have in your version history and recycle bins, the more Microsoft earns. An isolated architecture flips the script. It allows you to filter out the digital noise, back up only what matters, and store it in a vault that costs 20 times less. You aren't just building a more resilient system, you are stopping a massive invisible leak in your IT budget. Architecting the isolated backup vault, cost is the entry point for the conversation. But building the vault isn't about saving pennies on storage. It is about a fundamental shift in how we define a safety zone. For years, we relied on the physical air gap. You remember the routine. You wrote to a tape. You put that tape in a lead-lined box. You sent it to a salt mine. That was the ultimate defense, because a hacker in Russia couldn't reach into a physical mine in Kansas. But in a cloud-native world, that model is dead. We need to move to the logical air gap. This isn't about distance. It is about the absolute severance of control. The foundation of this architecture is the identity-first perimeter. You cannot build a vault inside your production house. You must create a secondary, completely isolated Entra tenant. This tenant exists for one purpose: recovery operations. It has no trust relationship with your primary domain. There is no federation. There is no synchronization of users. If your production tenant is the target of a scorched earth attack, the secondary tenant remains invisible. It is a ghost in the machine. It doesn't know your production passwords, and your production admins don't have accounts there. Within this isolated tenant, we implement the worm principle. Write once, read many. This is the technical enforcement of immutability. We aren't just checking a box in a policy menu. We are implementing vault locks at the storage layer. These locks are governed by a clock, not a person. Once a recovery point is written and the lock is engaged, it becomes a permanent record. Even a global admin in the backup tenant cannot override it. If an attacker manages to breach your secondary perimeter, they find themselves staring at a mountain of data they can see but cannot touch, modify, or delete. But technology alone isn't enough. We need a human gatekeeper. This is the 4 eyes approval model. In your production environment, we prioritize agility. We want things to happen fast. In the backup vault, we prioritize friction. Any destructive operation, like changing a retention policy or attempting to delete a vault, must require multi-party authorization. This authorization must happen outside the production loop. It requires 2 separate individuals using 2 separate devices, authenticating against 2 separate systems. You are intentionally slowing the system down to prevent a single compromised human from becoming a single point of failure. This leads us to the critical separation of the data plane and the control plane. Your backup engine, the software that actually moves the bits, should never see or know your production credentials. It should operate using managed identities or scoped service principals that only have the permission to read data. The control plane, which manages the scheduling and the logic, lives in the isolated vault. The data plane, which handles the transport, sits in a middle ground. This ensures that even if the backup software itself is exploited, the attacker cannot pivot from the backup server into the heart of your production secrets. Finally, you must design for the clean room recovery. When you are hit with ransomware, your production environment is a crime scene. It is contaminated. You cannot simply restore your data back into the infected tenant and hope for the best. Your isolated vault must support restoration into a forensic sandbox. This is a clean room where you can scan the data for dormant malware, verify the integrity of your files, and rebuild your core services before you reconnect to the internet. You aren't just restoring data, you are restoring trust. You are providing the business with a verified, clean starting point. Building the vault is the first step toward that resilience. But the final, most important step is ensuring the identity itself is air-gapped. The Zero Trust Identity Perimeter. We have to apply the principle of never trust, always verify to the very pipes that move your recovery data. In most M365 environments, the backup service account is a silent passenger on the production identity bus. It's synchronized, it's federated, and it's visible. This is a massive mistake. To achieve true isolation, your backup service accounts must be excluded from production synchronization. They shouldn't exist in your primary Entra ID directory. They shouldn't be part of your federated trust. If an attacker runs a discovery script against your production tenant, they should find nothing that points toward the vault. The backup infrastructure needs to be invisible. This is where the managed identity advantage becomes your best friend. We need to stop using long-lived secrets and traditional service principles that require manual password rotation. Those are just static targets for an attacker. By using managed identities within Azure, you eliminate the risk of a credential being leaked or scraped from a configuration file. The identity is tied to the resource itself. It only exists when the backup job is running, and it vanishes when the task is done. You are shrinking the window of opportunity from 24 hours a day to the 30 minutes it takes to run a Delta sync. But we need to go deeper. We need to hide the vault from the public internet entirely. This is the role of ZTNA, or Zero Trust Network Access. Your backup storage shouldn't have a public IP address. It shouldn't be reachable via a standard URL that can be brute-forced or targeted by a DDoS attack. By implementing a ZTNA gateway, you ensure that only verified, healthy devices located within your isolated recovery tenant can even see that the storage exists. You are essentially taking your data off the map. Finally, you must monitor for anomalous token usage. This is the proactive layer of the perimeter. By feeding your backup identity logs into an XDR platform, you can set triggers for behavior that looks like an attacker. If a backup identity suddenly attempts to access a mailbox it has never touched before, or if it requests a token from an unusual geographic location, the system must automatically revoke all sessions. You aren't just watching for failed logins, you're watching for successful logins that don't make sense. The goal is a backup system that is a ghost. It performs its duty, moves its data, and then disappears back into the shadows. The shift from redundancy to resilience isn't a technical upgrade, it is a survival strategy. You are moving from a model that hopes for the best to a model that is architected for the worst. Your challenge this week is simple. Audit your blast radius. Identify every key to your backup vault and see if it's currently sitting in your production pocket. If it is, you are one compromise away from total failure. Connect with me on LinkedIn to discuss the 2026 Vault standards. Subscribe to M365 FM for the deep dives your board needs to hear. Stop navigating, start building.